is a book vise, also known as a lying press. It has tapered sides, and it's a tool that you use constantly when doing bookbinding, no matter whether you are marking the pages, cutting them, working on the spine, working on the cords. You just constantly go back and forth to this tool. Now, if you turn it around, then you can see that we have a groove in here, and we can fit this tool in the groove. And this is a cutting plough, also known as a book plough. And it's what you use to trim the pages of a book so that they are super crisp and sharp. Now, I have just completed a rather detailed building plan of these two projects. It's actually two projects in one plan. So if you are interested in building your own bookbinding equipment, this plan would be very useful. It goes through step-by-step instructions, cut lists, tips, things to think about, all of those things. So in this video, I want to go over these tools, like how they're made and how you use them. So these tools right here are part of my bookbinding workshop series. I also have a book press right behind me. I have a sewing frame in the corner there. And now, with the addition of the vise and the book plough, I have pretty much all the tools that I need. And I have individual building plans for the sewing frame and the book press, as well as these, or you can get the bundle with all of them if you have ambitions to build your entire book bindery, as we have done. So, what do we have here? Well, let's start with the vise, shall we? This is a pretty thick and substantial vise. The wood is 3 inches thick and 5 1/4 inches high, and it's nice with more mass like this because it just makes everything more stable. Now, if you have access to rough sawn wood and tools like a jointer and a planer, great, you're able to create those sizes. If you're not though, and most people probably wouldn't, then you could glue 2 or more pieces of wood together. Hardwood would be nice. However, you could even glue together several pieces of Baltic birch plywood, for example, for a very stable and clean looking option. So it's all about finding what's going to work for you. So while one person might use oak or maple, another person might use framing lumber or plywood glued together, the vise will still work. For this build, we used hard maple, which certainly is nice, but not necessary. Now, when it comes to the wooden screws, here is one area where hardwood is necessary. Now, these wooden screws here are pretty chunky. We made these using 2 1/4 inch tap and die set. Now, that's not an easy size to get a hold of. So in the plan, I have instructions on how either to use 2 1/4 inches, if you can get a hold of that, or you can use a 1 1/2 inch wooden tap and die set. Now, picking up a 1 1/2 inch tap and die set is a good idea. It's what we use for the sewing frame as well as the screw in the book plough. So, what is a tap and die set? Well, it consists of a tap, which cuts the internal threads inside a pre-drilled hole, and a die, which forms the external threads on a dowel or a rod, allowing the screw to fit into the threaded hole. You can pick up wooden tap and die sets in different sizes. However, 1 1/2 inches is the largest readily available size I've come across. When you make screws, you do need that 1 1/2 inch round dowel. So ideally you have a lathe and you can turn a piece of hardwood to that size. If not, you'll need to find a hardwood dowel of that size, which can be a little tricky. Softwood won't really work because the threads won't hold up over time, or you can't really create them too good in the first place. And then there's also procedure in making these screws. You want to soak the wood in mineral oil for some time beforehand to make sure that the wood doesn't tear as you are creating the threads. I personally really like wooden screws, even though they can be a little bit creaky and maybe not super smooth sometimes, but they are the traditional choice. They're very classic and they're very strong. If you wanted to replace these with metal screws, you could certainly do that. Then you would drill a hole through the jaws the size of the screw, and you would secure a nut in the back of the jaw. You could carve out a section in the wood to have it inset. That's an option as well. So again, this plan is a guide for you to create a system that will work with your setup and what you have available. So if you want to use the vise here, I actually use one of the rods from the book Plough. It's kind of nice to have multi-purpose because you don't need an extra rod around. And what you do is there's holes in the collars here, and you open or close the vise, turning these. You can also just kind of, go by hand up to a point, when you wanna, sometimes it can get stuck a little bit and then it's easier to use the rod. And if it's really tight, you'll definitely need this. But for example, you just put something in here, and of course you wanna do it evenly on both sides. And then you can, tighten a little bit extra. If you're working on a relatively small book, then this height is fine. If you are working on something larger, then you can simply prop up some support pieces under here. Now, that's what I was doing on this book that I was working on here. This is a leather journal book, and it's quite large. So I've just added some 2x4s underneath here to raise this up a little bit. And then you can, work on any size book that you want. So in terms of the construction, it's pretty simple really. We have these two jaws, and on the one side here we have taper ends, and this is just to help us in some of the tasks that we're doing. We have holes going through them. We also have some caps right here. We have our screws with a collar on the end here to keep the screws from going all the way through. On the inside of the first piece here we have just smooth holes, but the inside of this hole is threaded, and this is what enables us to close and open the vise. I was curious. I was just working on a project where I was making this leather journal going, from start to finish, and I was curious how many times did I use this vise and this Plough throughout the process. So I used it first to mark out the paper, like where the holes should be. Then I cut the holes using a saw while secured here. Next, I turned the vise around to use the Plough, and then I trimmed all the pages, and you get such a nice crisp paper that way. It's really nice. Then I turned it around again, and I kept the book in the vise to glue the backing, and then I shaped the spine in here. And then I separated the cords. Then I glued on the paper on the spine, and then I glued the cords. So for this one book that I was making, I used these tools here for 8 separate jobs. So you can see you just constantly go back and forth to using these tools. It's basically like having an extra pair of hands, right? Like any vise, so that you are free to focus on other things while keeping the work nice and secure. So for the majority of the work, I keep it like this. But then you have the one time when you want to trim the pages, and that's when it's really nice to have this option. So when that time comes, we flip it around. There's a runner on the bottom of here. We put that in the groove, and we can put our rod in here too, and this is to keep it nice and stable. So the job of this one is to trim the pages of the book, because once you have folded and sewed your book together, the pages are not perfectly even and crisp. You may want to bring it down in size even, or reshape the book a little bit. Okay, so what do we have here? Basically, we have 2 blocks of wood. We have 2 smooth rods. Now in the middle here, we have a wooden screw, and there's a handle on this side. Now the hole in here is just smooth, whereas the hole here have threads on the inside that we create with the tap and die set. And if we turn this around, we have a runner underneath, and this is what fits into the groove on the vise. And here you can see there's also an indentation right here, and this is where the blade goes. So this is the blade that we're using. It's an extra block plane blade. So the blade for a cutting plough needs to be round, because if it is square, it's going to get stuck in the paper. The way you use it is you secure the blade underneath the plough. You put your booklet in the vise, then you bring the blade out to the edge of the paper and slowly start advancing the blade as you're moving the plough. And then you bring it up again, keeping the plough in that position. Then you bring it down while advancing it a little further, and that way you keep going, cutting the paper. If the blade had been square, it would have gotten caught. Now, first we experimented with using a chisel for a blade, but it's really hard to cut a hole in steel in a chisel when there's no hole there already to start out with. The block plane blade already has holes, so you can work with those and countersink holes in order to secure the blade. The edges are rounded using a grinder and then sharpened using a sharpening wheel. Now you definitely need some sort of grinder to grind the blade to create this shape. However, you can use whatever sharpening method you have in order to get it sharp, and then hone it as well to keep it sharp. And really, the thing is, you can use whatever you have on hand for the situation. A block plane blade is pretty affordable, and you might even have an extra one of those lying around in your shop already. We are carving out a section underneath the plough to fit the blade, so you can adjust this to fit whatever you have access to, although it does need to be round and there need to be holes in the blade so you can secure it to the plough. The thing I really like about this tool is that it does this one job really well. It does get the paper just super crisp and even and smooth. And that is just really hard to accomplish using a razor blade. And unless you have access to a guillotine, that can do a lot of pages at once. And I'm not talking about a guillotine like one of these, because I have one of those. And these I use if I'm cutting, a couple of pieces of paper at once. But if you have a booklet with lots of paper, I can't use something like this because it just won't work. This can only cut a couple of sheets at once. However, with this tool you can cut as thick a book as you'd like. There's really no limit to how thick the book can be. So when you're using this, you just want to make sure that you're taking your time, you're advancing the blade slowly, you get a good rhythm, you get a feel for how to use it after a while, and you just kind of move it back and forth. If you get stuck, you can just kind of reverse it a little bit and then just go back and forth and do it a couple of times. The way you forward the blade with the screw while you're moving it back and forth and you have your booklet secured in the vise, it's like ingenious. It works really well. And the interesting thing is that, this is not a new design. Both the vise and the plough, these tools have been around since the Middle Ages, right? In bookbinding shops. These work pretty much the same now as they did then, so they do their jobs really well. And if you're going this classic bookbinding route, you might as well go full out. Now these marks here are created when separating the linen cord with an awl. At first I was debating, should I sand this and make it look all new? But no, this is just the way this looks. As you use it over time, you get these marks if you do work with linen cords and you want to separate them. So it's kind of cool. So we have this nice slope here for different jobs like rounding the spine, for example. Now obviously you could make a separate vise just to operate this, but that doesn't make any sense, right? Because you need a vise anyway when doing bookbinding. So it's much more reasonable to be able to turn it around, put it in a groove, and then use this vise, which you already use for all of these other tasks. And I like that, how this creates a more efficient situation. You don't have unnecessary tools or duplicates of tools around. I think one of the biggest things, like when you start doing bookbinding at first, and you don't really need many tools, right? You can use a razor blade, you can just fold paper, you don't need a sewing frame, you can sew everything by hand, and that's fine. But over time, as you start, working on more books, you realize that if you had some of these tools, a lot of jobs would just be a lot easier, or the result would be crisper, especially like when it comes to something like this plough. It's amazing how much crisper and cleaner you can get the pages if you use something like this. And really, the concept here is not difficult. It is a simple concept, which also is why it's kind of appealing. So if you're interested in making your own bookbinding tools, then make sure to check out my plan. This one is pretty detailed. It's 26 pages long. At first I was debating whether to separate this into two different plans, but then I decided that no, I'd just rather combine them in one plan since they are somewhat related. And so you can either choose whether you want to just do the vise, if you're just interested in doing the vise, or if you want to do the vise and the plough. The vise doesn't really change much if you only want to use this, other than you don't need a groove, on the bottom side. But But if you're making a vise, then you might as well make a plough if you have the use for one. I'll put a link in the description below to the plan. Also, make sure to check out the other videos about these other tools, about the press and about the sewing frame, and the accompanying plans if you're interested in that. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye.